Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
80-bit Pod Smash,
where gaming goes to grab a beer. We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite. I am Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right, and tonight we are talking about in-game lore. And you know what? Confession time, Termite. I switched up the topics. We were supposed to be doing an episode on game endings tonight, and I messed up.
Oh, nice.
So we are doing lore instead tonight.
Well, I guess we'll have to report that to our board members and tell them of our blunder.
So sorry.
Hopefully it won't affect our shares.
My, what a blunder. It makes me even wonder why I even bring the thunder.
Why he even brings the thunder.
But so we'll be doing, we'll just switch those two. It doesn't mess up our order anymore. But yeah, so we were talking about in-game lore tonight, which is a kind of just another slightly fitting one for October. Not super fitting, but slightly fitting. So we'll get into what lore is and what it means to video games. That will be our main topic. But we like to start out by talking about what we are drinking, because we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So what are you drinking tonight?
As a continuation of my Sam Adams variety pack, where I had previously had Oktoberfest and like Jacko, I now have a Sam 76 lager, which I think it is there. Oh, there's a readable label. Here we go. The Sam 76 lager, drinkable beer you can taste. We set out to brew a beer that you can enjoy all day long without having to sacrifice flavor. This refreshing beer has a smooth taste, light citrus aroma, and clean lager finish. Perfectly brewed for rooting on your sports teams or chilling with friends. Okay, that has nothing to do with how it tastes.
Nope. How's it taste?
It tastes like a ridiculously generic lager. It just tastes like beer. You could put this in a can, like Lost, and it just says beer from the Dharma Initiative. Remember those cans?
Yeah.
Like, it's just a white label. It says beer. And
that's like an actual thing. Did you know that? Like, there's an actual beer out there that's just in a white can labeled beer. And
really?
Like, yeah, it's not for purchase anymore, but like it was there was a brewer or something that made that exact thing.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
Well, no, this is just a generic Sam Adams. Like, I think I don't know what they were going for. Maybe they're trying to pay homage to 1976 for some reason. If somebody in the audience knows what might have been significant in Boston or Sam Adams around 1976, or maybe 1776.
Sure, not 76. Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, I don't know. No idea. I am uneducated about this beer. 17.
Yeah. So, gosh, that's two Hamilton quotes already tonight, and not even
3 minutes in.
And we didn't even get to we didn't even do the obvious Sam Adams low-hanging fruit there. But I am drinking a Star Hill Festi Oktoberfest lager.
Ooh.
It is, it's not as good as Sam Adams Oktoberfest, I'll admit. It similarly mostly just tastes like a beer. It has a little bit of that maltiness, a little bit darker than like a typical beer because of the Marzen. But I'll read its little tag here. It says, smooth and malty with a clean finish. This is our tribute to German tradition of Marzen lagers. I really want to go to Star Hill. It's in Charlottesville, and I've never been before. But I get the feeling that Star Hill is one of those breweries that is like successful enough to be able to like distribute their beer statewide, and maybe even nationwide. But like they also, I get the feeling that they also have like some in-house beers that they only make in their brewery that are probably awesome. But I just have never been blown away by a Star Hill beer before. So I want to go to Star Hill and see if they have actually good stuff. But it's okay. It's good. It's just not amazing. So it just tastes like a lager.
They made Roxanne, and that's a sour that is awesome. Anyway. Yep.
What was that new version of the monkey of the
the like ginger monkey from Victory?
Ginger monkey, yeah, Victory.
Or something like that?
Yeah. I want that. I don't even know.
Oh,
that's
my gosh.
coming out for Christmas, isn't it? I kept thinking it was a October, a fall beer or something. And so I was looking for it at the store today because I saw the golden monkey and the sour monkey, and I was like, "Where's that other monkey?" But yeah, now you say it's ginger. I'm like, yeah, that's going to be one that we'll snag. I'll have to snag and share.
There's a variety pack of the Victory Mystical Monkey mixer pack. It has golden monkey, twisted monkey, sour monkey, and tart monkey.
That all sounds awesome. I want all of those right now. But
go get it. It's in stock in Alexandria at Total Wine.
Cool. All right. Well, cool. So we'll start off we no longer have a news section. That's kind of our biggest announcement right now, is we no longer spend the first 15 minutes of the show or whatever talking about news. And instead, we handle that in our brand new show, the 80-Bit Newscast, of which by the time this airs, there should be like 4 episodes of. And so you can check that out at 80bitpodsmash, or sorry, twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, or by going to YouTube the next day at go to 80bitpodsmash.com and follow the link to our YouTube channel there, and you can check out our new show. So those go live on Twitch on Mondays, where you can actually interact with us live, and if you miss it, you can check it out on YouTube later. But we cover pretty much the weekly news there, and then that way we've tightened up our actual show, this show, a little bit. So that is that. Any other housekeeping things or anything you want to share from your life?
We have 3 avenues for you guys to experience us. Again, as you said, 80bitpodsmash.com is our landing website where our podcast exists. There are links to all of the podcast platforms: Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio. There are links to our social media networks: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, Discord. There's a link to our Discord through all of our show notes, and you can find us. That episode drops every midnight on Monday morning. Monday evening at 8 p.m., twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash. You can find us live where we'll do our newscast episode, as you just mentioned. But also on Wednesday nights, we are also at twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash playing games with our audience, hanging out with you guys, doing our live video game feed. So make sure you join us, jump in, interact with us, tell us your thoughts, concerns, questions, thoughts, and ideas. I may have said thoughts twice. But man, I want to do a quick what do you learn?
Okay, sure. Let's hit it up. What do you learn?
So I'm currently working through Control, and made by Remedy, published by 505 Games. They did Max Payne and some other various things. I guess there's a whole verse, like Alan Wake exists in this universe. Control, it's like very paranormal, multi-dimensions, other dimensional beings and such. Very, very, very obtuse at the beginning. Like, no idea what's going on. You're this woman, her name is Jessie, and you're just dropped into this Bureau of Control, which seems like a government facility. You have no idea.
X-Files. Think like X-Files, like bureaucrat, like a bureaucratic government agency tasked with like protecting America from extra-dimensional threats.
But you don't know that.
Sure,
like, the game just throws you in. Like, I'm just speaking from the perspective of the player as you boot the game for the first time.
Yeah, I guess okay, I understood.
I'm a girl named Jessie, and I'm in this bureau, and I'm like, who? What? I'm the director now. Okay, and the previous director's body is and I pick up this gun, which I didn't know was very significant until like later. What is it called? The
service weapon, I think.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that was the gun I had in my hand when it was referenced by something else. I'm like, what is this service weapon? I had no clue it was my gun. I don't know if I'm just an idiot or a moron, but it took a long time for all of these things to kind of click as the story unfolds. But it got really, really good. And like after the fifth mission or so, you learn about the main character's brother. I'm just going to leave it at that to avoid spoilers. And at that point, it really starts to get its stride and like really suck you in, and you want to keep going. And it deals with all of this like depth of questioning reality and questioning organizations. And I'm not a questioner by nature. My personality type is not one to question authority. I just take it as is and follow it to the letter of the law.
It's really annoying, yeah.
Exactly, right. It's hard to get along with because I'm just going to throw the book at you. And so like to have a story that kind of explores like doing that initially,
what is reality,
but then questioning all of that and like questioning who is really the bad guy, who's really the good guy, is really cool. And I'm not done with the game yet. The gameplay itself, there's no difficulty scale, and it's a third-person shooter that allows you to throw objects like telekinetically, and then allows you to fly and kind of use the service weapon changes its form, and you can choose 2 of the different types. There's like sniper rifle, shotgun, pistol.
You will agree with me real quick. You'll agree with me when the launch mechanic, the telekinesis of like, it is as viscerally satisfying to do as the Leviathan axe in God of War. Would you agree with me? Or it's like almost like they're very close together. Like it's a very mechanically sound game in regards to the powers that you get. The guns are not that innovative, but the powers are really cool.
Yeah, the powers are really cool. The enemies kind of seem generic. There's only a couple of cut and paste types, and they just kind of throw them at you randomly as you explore. Sometimes it's annoying. The map is ridiculously difficult to navigate. As you may know from my live streams, I am horribly directionally challenged. I will get lost in a split second. If anything in the environment looks the same at all, I'm going the wrong direction and have no idea until it's too late. Like, I do this all the time. Halo 1 was maddening because all the insides of those buildings look the same, and I would just run around in circles for like 20 minutes before I realized where I was. Control is no exception here.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
I can't follow the map. It's multi-leveled, and I don't know how to get to where I need to go. And there's no waypoint system. Like, I'm used to hit that hand holding when it comes to like, go find the 5 things in this room. I'm like running around trying to find the 5 things in this room. I have no idea. So there's a lot of pain points. Some of the assist things you can turn on, I discovered late for accessibility, allow you to change some of the handicap sliders in your favor so you can take less damage and have more energy, etc. And so I'm starting to get my stride. I'm starting to enjoy it. I'm loving the story. I'm in all kinds of cool things, objects of power that are linked to other dimensions, and like it's pretty cool. So Control, and
yeah, it's a good one.
That's it. Yeah,
I played it
last year,
around like early this year. Actually, it was maybe it was last year. Gosh, I don't even know.
You platinumed it in January, so you started it in December.
Yeah.
I don't stalk your trophies. I don't know what you're talking about.
I got it. I think because I got it for Christmas. That's right. You got it for me for Christmas. So that's when I played it, and it came out last August, and it was definitely a highlight for me. But I remember the map being kind of annoying, but I remember like eventually picking onto it and getting. But for real quick, what are you playing? I'm just trying to get the platinum on Borderlands 1. So that's mostly what I've been pouring my time into.
That was a gift for you too, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a gift for my birthday this year. So
yeah.
So shout out to my sister Kristen. Thank you for adding to my Borderlands collection and addiction.
Sweet.
All right. So cool. So that being able to get to favorite things 12 minutes into the episode is our favorite thing, but also
doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
Doing this podcast is our favorite thing. Favorite Things is a segment of our show where we share with you the thing that we are excited about. It can be video game related, but it doesn't have to be. And we are hoping that you might be able to be either inspired to go find a similar thing or to actually go out and get our favorite thing and figure out for yourself if it's your favorite thing. Wow. It's a roundabout way of explaining that. So, Termite, what's your favorite thing this week?
My favorite thing, we've had a pretty stressful week. My wife is in grad school, and she's in a class, computer science related algorithms class, that is wrecking her. And it requires so much time. So I spent the weekend just watching the kids throughout the entire weekend while all of the things in her life that need to get done on a regular basis were ignored, such as mowing the grass, laundry, cleaning the house. None of that stuff got done. And I was excited, and I'm racking my brain. So it's my favorite thing because I did something with Sam, my oldest child. It was kind of a one-on-one fun moment, but I can't remember what we did. I'm racking my brain trying to remember what it was, but it was either a restaurant or ice cream. But I do know one that happened today, so I'll just use that one because my memory serves me well. He asked me if I wanted to play. It is a Paw Patrol version of Go Fish, but it's called Go Pup. And he's never like straight up came up to me and said, hey, do you want to play this card game? Because he's usually too rambunctious. He's into too much stuff, and he doesn't want to focus on paying attention to the rules of a game. So he did. I was like, sure, let's do that. And we sat and played like after dinner, after his bath, for like 20 minutes. And ran through several rounds of Go Pup, and he destroyed me. Of course, the game is like luck based, and it was awesome because I never let him win on everything. And so it's probably my own fault that he never asks to like play some things with me, which is why whenever he comes to me with Tic-Tac-Toe or Connect 4, I'm like, yes, we're going to play, but I never let him win. I always want him to think, and I challenge him to think for himself and like how to beat me and explain strategies. This goes back to my personality trait about following the rules. And so he actually beat me in Draw Pup or Go Pup, whatever it was called. And it was so fun. He legitimately did beat me. It was awesome. So it was like this cool one-on-one moment with my 5-year-old. So there you go.
Awesome. My favorite thing is something that you probably won't be able to recreate unless you are one of the backers for the Way of Kings Leatherbound Edition Kickstarter campaign. My first, so I contributed to it at a very low level at like $50 in order to get a physical copy of the novella. But it comes with a bunch of swag, and the first round package of swag. I just got an email before we started today that it is shipped and will be here by Wednesday. So it'll probably be my favorite thing next week too, and I actually get to dig into it and figure out what this whole bag of swag is. But as of right now, I'm just super stoked now. I'm like, yay, my week just got awesome. So I'm looking forward to my Way of King swag bag. And if you did contribute to the campaign, you have probably already received your swag bag as well. So we can nerd out and talk together about it. But,
what will you get? Like, what's confirmed? What is not the whole thing?
Gosh, so the book itself doesn't ship until like January because he just finished writing it. So the novella. So he has to, it has to print or whatever. I didn't contribute at a high enough level for the leather bounds itself either. So those I know ship separately. But I think there's like one swag bag for the there's a bunch of swag related to your Radiant Order, which you have when the campaign was over, they sent a survey to get like what your self-reported, which order of stuff you wanted basically. And so since they didn't have people, like they knew ahead of time how many people total contributed at a level enough to get the swag. So I think they started the production of all the non-Radiant swag ahead of time. So things like a bookmark, some like cool little like collector's coins and some other stuff like that. And that's all not connected to the order itself that you chose. So that all is like, I think that's what's coming, is all the non-Radiant stuff. Because the Radiant stuff, they had to wait until they knew who was going, like how many people were in each, like we're ordering for each order, basically.
Right.
So I think that's coming separately. But yeah, it's like stickers, like cool, like sewable patches, a bookmark. I'm like, the bookmark I'm excited about. There's a bumper sticker that says Journey Before Destination. I'm excited about the Journey Before Destination bumper sticker. And so stuff like that. I'm super stoked. And then I am stoked for my, my order stuff, but that's not coming till later. So either way, it's a bunch of just like cheap swag, but I'm excited about it.
Yay!
So, anyways, that's favorite things. Then moves us to our next segment, which is
Bing, bing, bing.
DLC, which stands for downloadable content. It is a fun discussion, a mini discussion, some discussion you wouldn't normally have about video games. So I want you to think of a non-Metal Gear Solid video game character. Or no, sorry. Not, you don't have to think of one ahead of time. I'll just give you the prompt, and then we can think of one together. So, So what video game character that is not from Metal Gear Solid would you use as a folktale to scare your grandchildren into doing something? So again, this is inspired by the idea that the real world use of the term lore usually refers to folklore, which is folklore is all about like spooky, scary stories, that you would tell your kids in order to get them to behave a certain way, like Krampus or whatever. Don't you be good around the holidays, or Krampus will stuff you in a sack and beat the crap out of you, or whatever Krampus does. So what is a video game character? If you had grandchildren and they were acting up in certain ways, how would what video game character would you choose to scare the behavior into them? That's probably terrible parenting, but you know what? You're a grandparent, so you don't have to worry about that.
I'm a grandparent?
Yeah, so again, you're not a parent, you're a grandparent, and your kids, you're like, hey, don't drop your controller, or Bowser will come to you in the night and feed you to the Koopas or whatever. Right. You know what I mean? Something like that.
So that limits some of the choices down now. It has to be an older video game franchise that may has not been introduced to newer audiences, not been remade or brought forward.
I mean, it could be whatever you want. All I want is a video game character.
And I'm thinking
the behavior you're trying to correct can be related to video games or not. It would be fun if it was.
No, I'm just thinking of like scary beings. Ooh, I bet there's one. I have to look it up. I'm sorry, but okay, the Dark Genie as the main antagonist of Dark Cloud.
Oh yeah, that's
how cool and good pull is that? Like that would be perfect. Here's this big scary genie who's going to come out and wreck your face, or cause a lot of havoc, or wreck your house, wreck your toys if you don't listen to the rules. So that's what I'm going with.
That's a good one. I might pull something from WoW and do like the Lich King. Like, make sure that you put the toilet seat down, or the Lich King will come freeze your butt off. They'll be like, who's the Lich King? Be like, he sits on the greatest toilet of all, the Frozen Throne.
He's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, right? Like, If you were just sleeping and you woke up and saw the silhouette of the Lich King with the blue glowing eyes in your window, like, you'd certainly grab
scared.
your gun. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, then that's the DLC. Let us know what your video game character's turned folk story is, and what behavior are you trying to correct from your future grandchildren. That should be a fun one to discuss. So the best place to do that would be to go to should be a Reddit thread already ready to go to talk about that. So hop over onto Reddit and share your ideas with us, because we want to hear them. So where else could they share their fun DLC?
The best ways for you to share your fun DLC with our community is to go to our Discord server. And there's a link to that Discord server in all of our show notes. And our show notes go live on 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing site, where it has all of our shows, all of our notes, and all the links to all the podcast platforms that you might care about. You can interact with us on Discord. And then, we have our twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash live streams, both on Monday and Wednesday nights. Monday is more of a news show, so it's not as interactive, but Wednesday is our game stream. You can totally jump in and interact with us there and tell us what you would want to, what character you would want to scare your children into doing and the behavior you desire. So, without further ado, let's get on to our main topic.
All right. So we are talking about in-game lore, and we'll start with what it is. What are we talking about when we talk about lore? How is it different from other kinds of storytelling? And what are the different kinds of delivery methods that games employ in order to communicate lore to the players?
As you are very excited about your swag bag that is only relevant to you because of lore, but I guess that's a book. So
yeah, well,
books are kind of inherently lore.
They will often have lore, yeah. They will often have their own.
What is lore?
Yeah, I mean, lore is basically just, it's, and yeah, it's not exclusive to video games, like many kinds of, you especially see it in like fantasy or sci-fi. Lore is just the context in which the story takes place. So it's not the narrative itself. It's not the plot. It's not the, point A to point B of the story. It's not Termite went down the stairs to grab a drink. He tripped on the stairs and broke his shin and had to go to the hospital. Like, that's the narrative. The lore would be like, so Termite had a bunch of beers in his fridge that were Star Hill, a variety pack of Star Hill. And by the way, Termite lives in Virginia, which is one of the 50 states of the, you know what I mean? Like, so it's all the background, it's all the context, it's all the details in which the story takes place, and it's the kind of the big picture in which the narrative takes place. And so that's exactly what it is. It's all the background details that you need to know in order for a story to make sense. So yeah, that's kind of how it contrasts with, the narrative, which is then the events of the story that take place point A to point B, the climactic structure. We've talked about all the different kind of story types in this podcast before in our plot episode. So all those different plot things, the plot is the kind of the narrative, and then the lore stands aside from the narrative, and there's a whole bunch of different ways it can be delivered. So that's, again, it can be just like characters talking about it and being like, yeah, so gosh, that war happened 50 years ago. That was nuts, wasn't it? That's giving lore, that's providing context. It can be done, and often is, environmental storytelling, books on the shelf that give, and in some cases, it can just be the collected history book, history books, outside materials, things like game manuals and stuff like that often provide lore, used to often provide lore. And even just the games themselves. If you have an existing franchise, the lore is comprised of all the events that happened in those previous games. So the Zelda lore, the collection of Zelda lore is, there's a couple places you can find Zelda lore, but the best place to find Zelda lore is to play the games. And then that way, when you play the newest entry, all the context that came before, provides that background. So make sense? Yeah.
And some of my favorite part of lore is outside of the game in a physical version. So like I have on my shelf behind me, if you watch my live streams, you'll see in my background, I have a whole bookshelf of gaming magazines, but also encyclopedias. I have a Mario encyclopedia. I have a video game console book that maps all the consoles. That's not really gaming lore, but it's there. And I have 4 Zelda Hyrule Historia encyclopedias that map through all the concept art and all of the story of Breath of the Wild, as well as the timeline for Zelda and all the things. So tons of lore, tons of story content that I love to go use as reference for things whenever I feel like it.
Yeah, and a lot a lot of games will do like companion novels too. So like Halo had, before Halo Reach came out, there was a Halo novel called Reach that actually provided the backstory of what would eventually become Halo Reach, but from the character of Master Chief's perspective. So yeah, you can, and then, you know, WoW is famous for having a bunch of like novels as well that also are another source of lore that will then oftentimes be referenced, or tie into the main game, or tie into at least events that the main game talks about. So that's another kind of way it's delivered, another source. So, cool. So what does lore do for a game? Like, how can a good, well thought out, well put together in-game lore, how does that enhance the video game experience? And, you know, or I should say, in contrast to that question, can too much lore be a bad thing? Is there any way in which lore could detract from the experience?
The article I'm going to quote from that answers part of this question wonderfully is an article by Keith Stewart over at Eurogamer from 2016. It's about allowing players to discover story content rather than having it shoved at them. It's about the pull rather than the push. To use the horrible language of UX methodology, that's pull push stuff. BioShock is a wonderful example of this. Obviously, the audio tapes provide backstory and entertaining and intriguing chunks, but then you also have the whole Mason scene of Rapture. The way certain scenes are carefully set up to tell the story of this failed utopia, almost in tableau form. The environment feels like a carefully curated museum of lore. And that's what lore can do in a game to enhance the game experience. And then coming from a personal experience, most recently with The Last of Us Part 2, I'm so enthralled into that world and in that story that I took it upon myself to want to go after the extra in-game lore. There's all these collectibles. There are notes that are written to in-game NPCs, like they're just written amongst themselves, really flesh out the context of the outbreak and how whatever that disease was called was spread, and the things that people were going through. Like when you walk into in a hotel and you see a dead body and you pick up the note that's next to it, you find out that there was this couple, one of them got bit and they were going to try and just hide out together. And then the other guy couldn't do it. He couldn't survive without her. So he killed himself. And so like you see the body and then you see the infected person bust through the door and attacks you. And like, if you didn't read that note, you would have just seen, oh, it's just an enemy. Yep. It's another clicker that just busted the door. But now you know, like, no, that was the girl that got bit and she was sick and the guy was going to go on without her and couldn't. And so like you see that like breakdown in emotion all through a small little bit of lore in the game that you can read. So I think that's how it enhances the game experience.
Yeah, good lore makes a world feel real. You know, it makes a story feel real. It makes it like a place you can go. Like, because, you know, again, well thought out and well put together lore, it does just that. It's it's essentially a history of the game world. And like real history, when really well thought and really put together, there's the kind of like factual, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened. And then there's the idea that those things can be, those events, those true factual events are filtered through people's perception. You know, again, there's the old mantra that history is written by the winners. And so our perception of those events is then filtered through the people who have actually written about them and their biases and their predispositions and all that stuff. So good in-game lore will also do that as well. Will make it so that, you know, to make the world feel even more real, will, you know, slowly provide you with some differing perspectives instead of just a blow by blow. This happened, and this guy came to power and he was a jerk and he was the worst. Sometimes it might be like, oh, this dude came to power. And one character will be like, oh, he was the greatest king we ever had. And then you talk to another character and they'll be like, oh, he was just, he was a tyrant and an oppressor, and giving you those kind of nuanced histories. I think of like The Witcher. Now, The Witcher was pulling its lore from an existing book series. But nevertheless, they did a pretty good job of painting, like, sometimes you're like, yeah, Niflgaard, they're awesome. They're our friends. And this guy, he's kind of a jerk, but like he's on our side. And then other times you're just like, man, those Nilfgaardians, they're the worst. And different characters will, of course, feel differently about it depending on that. So, yeah, no, I also like the idea of like, again, well layered lore will also be like, you know, and I don't necessarily have a video game example of this, but I think of, again, the works of Brandon Sanderson is fresh on my mind considering the email I just got tonight. But what he does is he's like, here are the things that, like, he layers it, and he's like, in his mind, he's like, here are the things that actually happen. Now I'm going to present a bunch of intrigue and mystery and make it so that like you don't know those things when you first start the story. Like you can get through an entire book and be like, I thought this was one way, and then it turned out to be completely, the reality of what happened to these characters or in this world is completely different. And so I think good lore will do that as well, where it's like they'll present one version of the facts and then reveal over time that that version is not the correct version, and what actually happened was this. So I think I think games are capable of that level of storytelling. I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but yeah, so it's really just about building the sort of lexicon, the encyclopedia, if you will, of these in-game worlds and the events that happen therein.
A very like kind of shallow example of what you're talking about, and I say shallow because it didn't have as much, maybe it doesn't have as much depth, but it was huge for the 80s. 1984, 1985, Metroid for NES came out, and you play the entire game of Metroid, and you're running through, you're a space warrior with an arm cannon and all these cool upgrades and stuff. You get to the very end after you explore absolutely everything, and you sunk so much time, and the character takes their helmet off, and it's a female. And it blew everyone away. Like, oh my gosh, female protagonist, front and center. This is amazing.
What was that game called?
Metroid.
Yep.
I said that.
Oh, yeah. Did you say it? Oh, sorry.
I did. Yeah. But that's like one of those things that's kind of lore-ish because it's not prevalent in the narrative or the plot about what's going on. Exactly. You're just a bounty hunter. You're exploring this. You're trying to eradicate Metroids off this planet, and you're just going through it. Like, it has nothing to do with the narrative, but at the end, it's just boom, she's a female, and that changes the entire tone and context of the entire game. Here is in the middle of the 80s, a front and center female protagonist, and that was unheard of for video games at the time. And it was awesome, and like completely had a major.
Who Samus
impact.
Aran, the bounty hunter, is a major red herring in that first game. And again, the lore, because they basically drop you into this character, into the mind of this character, basically, who's a bounty hunter. You know they're a bounty hunter, and you know that they have cool space armor, and that they're fighting aliens. And that's about all you know about this character. That is the lore that you have of Samus in that first game. And then they do exactly that. They reveal, just through a very simple storytelling technique at the very end, oh no, this character is not even the gender that you think they are. And that foundation of even just knowing that Samus is a girl, is a woman, is a huge piece of the Metroid lore that like you need to know going into all the other games. So yeah, that's a good pull there. I like that. Mm-hmm. So, but then there are some other problems with lore. So how can lore kind of detract? How can too much lore or poorly written lore, how can that detract from the experience?
Lore that is disconnected from the narrative, but affects the narrative, can be disjarring. And you'll hear like a story beat or a plot point in a game and be confused. Wait, what's going on? And I'm actually experiencing this with Control, because you challenged me to read some of the collectibles that you get, because there's a whole bunch of like case files and artifacts and all this videos and audio tapes that you can find in Control spread around everywhere. It kind of helps flesh out the story. But without doing that, I felt like I had no idea what was going on. I felt kind of lost and not immersed in the story. And I think that is bad. That is a pit that lore, too much lore, or the wrong kinds of way to reveal the lore to the player can be by not putting it front and center in front of you. And so that's one bad thing. Sometimes having too much reading, too much lore. I think Skyrim is a good example of you just have lore shoved down your throat in droves, and it's just like, oh my gosh, I just want to play this story.
I want to play a game. I don't want to read. If I wanted to read, I would go read a book. Yeah, exactly.
Yep. And there's a place for it. Like, if you're really into Skyrim and you really love that story and that lore and it appeals to you, then you have so much content for you. That's good. But I'm just saying, from like a mass appeal, I guess Skyrim is like one of the most popular games ever. So it was obviously mass appealing, even though it did this poorly. It's too much reading. It's kind of dry. It's slow to get through. It's a slog. I would love to know the metrics on how much time people have spent actually reading the lore in Skyrim. Like, it is such a massive game. I would suspect that few people have actually read through a lot of the lore.
Sure.
But who knows? I could be wrong, but it just feels like a lot. And then sometimes you can just feel like you're in an exposition trap. You're just like, you're kind of done. Like, okay, you gave me enough information, but you're still giving me more. And that's kind of, that goes back to the push and pull method. Like, you're getting story driven. Like, it's an example kind of what Skyrim is doing. I'm trying to think of a game that does this differently, but it's just so much story, and you can't skip it. Like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'll elaborate on that point and say, like, I think a lot of games can suffer from proper noun fatigue, and the best examples of this is I think is some of the Final Fantasy games fall into this trap. Not so much the ones we grew up with, but the ones kind of after 10. And the one that comes to mind specifically is one I tried to play a few years ago when I first got my PlayStation. Didn't have a lot of games from it. I borrowed from our friend of the show, Matt. I borrowed Final Fantasy Type 0.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a 35-minute long cutscene intro into that game, and I didn't understand a word of it because it was 90%. I'm exaggerating, but it felt like it was 90% proper nouns, like the crystals and the Grand Academy of Grisoriamarge and the Great War with the elementalist manifestationals. I'm like, what is going on? I don't know. And it's like clearly someone sat down and created this elaborate lore and backstory for the world, but didn't deliver it at all well enough for it to be a cohesive thing. And the oftentimes, again, when you have just a bunch of proper nouns above a bunch of things that, like, you know, I mean, I could literally do it with Stormlight Archive right now. Things that when, you know, he writes it, the narrative, it makes sense. But if I'm just talking about it out of context, I could be like, yeah, Navani and her Fabrials, use the Surge of Regrowth to, none of those words make sense to anyone who's never read Stormlight Archive before.
Right.
But like, when games, oftentimes I think games are more guilty of this than many other mediums, storytelling mediums, is them just being like, so we've come up with all these proper nouns for all these cool concepts and ideas, but we never take the time to actually explain what those are. So instead we just like blurge them at you, and it's like, okay. Like even the Final Fantasy 16 trailer, I'm hoping the storytelling is a little bit more concise when you actually play the game, but the trailer itself just sounded like a bunch of proper nouns to me, like the crystals and Thomas is a elemental, another elemental summon. Like, okay, I kind of know what those words are, but like, what?
Right, unless you put in the legwork to like go in and read it and make sense of it yourself. That to me, it should be relegated to lore, not the narrative.
Right. Like, let people kind of discover that, make it feel more rich. Yeah, I find that like the lore that I like the most is the stuff that, so there's a couple different ones, but the stuff where like the story, the primary narrative and the primary exposition given in that narrative is like easy to digest in chunks. I think of like Borderlands, for example. Like I was able, without playing Borderlands 1, I was able to jump into Borderlands 2 and understand the context of what I needed to understand from Borderlands 1. And then I got into the story more and more, and then wanted to, like, once I kind of understood the story at hand, then I was like, ooh, I'm really fascinated to learn more about this world. So then I would go seek out all of the, audio files they leave around where the characters interact or talk to each other, or you get background on people like Maya, the characters you're playing and stuff like that. And those would then feel like genuinely interesting things, to the point where, like, I just build on that base of knowledge. I think World of Warcraft handled the lore well, too, because one of the things I think makes lore really compelling is when, like, if the lore gives, if the lore is completely disjointed from the narrative and is just meant to provide kind of context and make the world seem more real, that's okay. But when lore really gives you the goods is when lore will hint at things to come in either this game or future titles, where it's like, if I'm playing, I'll just say like Dark Souls, for example, and I come across a book that's like, great, I don't know any of the enemies in Dark Souls, but I'm assuming they're named things like Great Lord Malathoth the Black-Hearted or whatever. And it's like, Great Lord Malathoth the Black-Hearted took over, the world 500 years ago, but he disappeared at the end of his reign, and no one's seen or heard from him since. And then in Dark Souls 2, I come back and I fight Blackthorn Holothor the Blarg, like the same guy name. I forgot what name I even said now at this point. But like, if I come back and then get to experience that content, having discovered it in the previous game, like, oh my gosh, that's exciting. And that is actually something WoW I think did really well, which is like, they made this rich lore with all these different multifacets, and then they proceeded to spend the next, several expansions really letting the players experience, pieces of that lore, one at a time. So, we knew about Deathwing from Warcraft 2, and then they had a whole expansion centered around Deathwing. And we knew about the Lich King from Warcraft 3, and you had a whole expansion centered around the Lich King. Like, they took the time to really explore the world they created. And that's when I think lore is at its best, when it gives you a hint at things to come in either this game or subsequent titles.
I can't think of an example of this. Maybe World of Warcraft does it too. When extra lore or something you read in the game gives you a hint as to why like a boss would behave the way the boss does.
Yes.
And so like it could be a strategy, it could be, something to warn you about an incoming threat that's coming. But it's done through a way that's like fun and engaging through a nice piece of lore that you would like to read, and you get to experience it in the game. One other thing that I want to say is kind of a pitfall or a bad thing about lore is when it's superfluous. It really doesn't add anything. It's just there for no reason. And I'm thinking of like Uncharted. There's a lot of extra artifacts you can pick up and like learn about that really don't, like Nathan Drake doesn't really, it doesn't matter at all as you progress through it. Because the Uncharted series is really about the relationships between Nathan Drake and Elena and Sully and Chloe and all those characters and the things that they go through. And they're amazing games. They have awesome gameplay, but they don't like the extra things don't really build the story or the narrative of the game. And so it's just noise. I hate to say that because there's artists and people who wrote this stuff and like put time into it. And I feel bad, but that's kind of like the critique, right? It's like when you don't like food and you feel bad, the chef put this together for you, but you don't really like it and you can explain why. Yeah. That's one of the pitfalls of Uncharted. Now that knocks it from like maybe a 10 to a 9.5. I'm not saying it's that bad, but because the Uncharted games are amazing, but it is an example. And other games do this way worse, where you're just inundated with a bunch of stuff. It doesn't really affect anything.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Why do you think that lore is becoming more important in terms of video games and video game storytelling, in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe even longer than that? Do you think that lore is becoming more and more important? And why do you think that is? And if you don't have an answer, go ahead.
I do have an answer. A couple of reasons. Shooting from the hip, the budgets to make video games have now gotten so out of hand. They're so expensive and so big for these huge AAA titles. They cost an astronomical amount of money to make, and they require teams of hundreds of developers and PR and artists and sound and voice actors, etc., motion capture, that the only way to add more story is through different ways of lore. And I think so we're going to start to see a lot more extra ways of that coming out. And we have interactive websites, the technology around the internet, technology around social media, interactivity with phone apps and connectivity over the cloud. And all these things are going to allow and enable gamers to experience writers' stories in new ways that it's not just the narrative. And we're seeing that through graphic novels coming out that are being published digitally and videos on YouTube and cinematics. Like Overwatch has a whole, like, you don't need to know this, but every character has a whole like storyline for Overwatch. You can select, you can play Overwatch without ever having to watch those videos, and you're going to get the same experience as if you did, but you'll know more about each character. And that's one example of like
you'll
lore
feel more
kind of changing
to those characters. Yep. Mm-hmm.
You can go on YouTube and watch their little short, their like animated short. That's kind of new. So over the last 5 years, we're seeing this kind of trend to embolden the bottom of a video game to like prop up and support a game's story through content. Now I know game design, gameplay is key almost all the time. If the game is not fun or it feels wrong, it's not going to sell. The second most important thing about a video game is story, whether it's a puzzle game or if it's a full-blown RPG. Story is the most important thing. And so writers and artists are doing this work anyway. So why not fork out a different social media outlet to draw in more income and draw more appeal and marketing for your game by taking the work that's already being done and kind of leverage it in a new way. And with the internet and the way that we are 2020, we can do that easier, and it's not that expensive and doesn't cost that much more. So you can do that too. So that's kind of how lore is changing and evolving and allowing gamers to be able to experience games from different angles, more than just the narrative of picking up the controller.
Sure. I think that also lore is becoming important because franchises are just getting bigger, like fewer and fewer new franchises are being made, and more franchises are coming into existence that have continued entries in those franchises. So they're getting bigger, and they're, I think studios are finding more and more of a need to try to find a way to communicate the lore of the world that is important for the current narrative for each entry without having players have to go back and play all the games. But then furthermore, for the players who have played all the games and are invested in these worlds, game designers and developers are finding it more and more important to make sure that the lore is consistent and that things have maintained their continuity, because as we'll get to, a lore PR nightmare is having to do what's called retconning things, which is to go back and be like, yeah, sorry, we screwed up. We need to change this now. So more and more people are like, okay, we need to make sure that our characters are acting consistently with their history, that the world is consistent with what we've communicated before. So I think that, again, I was shocked to hear that Borderlands 3, they made a big deal about hiring a lore designer for their team, for their storytelling team, someone whose entire job it was just keep track of the lore and be like, yeah, no, you can't do that because that's wrong. Right. Like, no, you can't do that because, and then to help further, deepen and enrich and develop the lore. I'm like, oh my gosh, I want that job. That sounds awesome to be that guy.
And it makes sense. Like, yeah, I didn't even think about it. The more entries, like Borderlands 3 had come out and it was so appealing in its art style and its loot and the way they marketed it and advertised it. But a lot of gamers didn't play Borderlands 2 or the pre-sequel or the first one or Tales of the Borderlands. Yep. And you still have to you have to give those players something to want to have story-wise. So they did it in a
lot of videos and stuff like that. They're like, here's a catch-up, everything you need to know about Borderlands 2 in 5 minutes or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they did a lot of that marketing and stuff like that, which was good. But also they just they found ways to kind of communicate that without so they wrote the game's narrative in a way that it wasn't 100% crucial to understand it, but they definitely made a big deal out of that. And it's not always perfect, but it is it's becoming more and more ubiquitous, I think. So let's go ahead and talk about let's skip examples because I think we've already given several examples. I want to talk about retconning, and maybe if we have some time afterwards, we can talk about games that have handled lore well or poorly, but. So I brought up the idea of retconning, retroactive continuity, is what that stands for. And what the idea is that, at some point in time, a writer will come along. You've got constantly changing writing teams, writing staffs for games. This term was coined, I believe, in comic books, where you have different writers over decades handling the same characters, and a writer will come along and make a mistake, not having done the research or not having fully understood an event or something that happened. And it will be called out. It used to be all grassroots, the communities themselves would be like, hey, look, this is wrong. And then what you run into is what's called retroactive continuity, where usually the new writer who's in charge of the property will say, you know what? I screwed up. I messed up. Didn't do my research, but this is the new canon going forward, basically. So that's called retroactive continuity or retconning. And one of the more famous retcons in video game history was in World of Warcraft. At least in my video game history, I don't know if it is in history at all, but it was a pretty big deal. When Burning Crusade came out, they announced that the new playable race for the Alliance was the Draenei. And when they revealed the lore of the Draenei, I won't get too nerdy into it, but when they revealed the lore about the Draenei, there was a huge discrepancy into their origin. And basically they took on the appearance of a existing race in World of Warcraft that were a demonic race, that were evil. And so there was a big question because that specific race was responsible for corrupting the Satan figure in World of Warcraft lore, the good Titan that became bad. And this race was responsible for that. But then in the lore they presented for the new Draenei race, they were like, oh no, this evil Satan figure tempted and corrupted the Draenei. And that's how but there was this good group that escaped, and they're the playable kind or whatever. And it was completely, literally their lead writer, Chris Metzen, had to come out, and he literally, I even remember his exact wording to this day. And he was like, yep, I didn't do my homework on that one. I completely forgot what he had written, because it was his own work, and he had written in the Warcraft 3 manual the complete opposite of what they presented. So he had to formally retcon and say, we've already done all this development into the Draenei. There's no way we can change it now. So this is the new reality going forward. So yeah, that's what retconning is. And it's a pretty common thing that happens now. I mean, World of Warcraft has already retconned itself 50 different times in different contexts. Yeah. So retconning is when they actually have to go back and basically say, this is the new lore going forward because we made a mistake, or we are just choosing. Sometimes they purposefully retcon things because they're like, you know what, we need to blow this down before before we write ourselves into a box. I think actually Borderlands did that by introducing the quote 7th siren. So there are now, previously it was like there are only ever 6 sirens. When one dies, a new one inherits their powers. Now there's like a secret 7th siren that was locked away. And that's part of the in-game lore now that will be dealt with. But like, that's a retcon. So.
Another big famous retcon is the Legend of Zelda series timeline.
Oh, yes. That's a great retcon pull. That's
Hyrule Historia came out. It was published in 2011, and it had the quote, official timeline. And they have managed to fit all of the games into a coherent timeline by having a 3-way split of Ocarina of Time, one of which I still feel like is completely made up.
Oh,
where
I hate that.
Link,
I hate the one
where Link dies at his fight with Ganon at the very end of the game, which does not exist
every
anywhere
time,
in any game.
Every time you lose in Ocarina of Time, you have created the 3rd timeline, is basically how they justify it. I don't even know if they necessarily formally justify it like that, but that's the only way I can, because again, canon, like speaking of the canonicity, every other timeline makes sense except for that one where it's like Link died and Ganondorf ruled, and that's this made up stupid timeline that only exists if you lose the game.
Yep. And another famous one was Metal Gear Solid 5. Of course, I've talked about Metal Gear Solid. The Phantom Pain establishes that the antagonist character we always thought of as Big Boss was actually a body double of the real Big Boss called Venom Snake, who was killed by Solid Snake during an encounter in the game. The original Big Boss later becomes the antagonist in the series' second entry, Metal Gear Solid 2 Solid Snake. So a crazy huge retcon at the end of Metal Gear Solid 5 that changes who you think Big Boss is across all of the games. Yeah. So, like completely just, okay.
Okay, yep, exactly.
Thanks,
yep.
Kojima, for doing that.
Yep. Yeah, yep. No, retcons are pretty, they're annoying when you come across them because you want writers to you want them to think about these things ahead of time and not write themselves into corners. Because you want it to just be consistent all the way through. That's what the word continuity means, is that it's that you want continuity to be maintained because those are the most compelling stories. But when they have to be like, nope, sorry, it was actually this whole time. It clearly is like, you made a mistake. You made a whoopsie. And what you either did it on purpose or on accident. It doesn't matter your intention. It's like, it's always a disappointing part of lore. Sometimes it's necessary, but sometimes it's just like, okay, whatever. You clearly didn't think this through well enough. So hopefully we see less and less of that as time goes on, as the writers get more experienced with how to handle writing in the medium. And the other thing too is also making sure that game developers, you don't want the game decisions to necessarily dictate the story. Ideally, you want the story to help. You want them to work in tandem with one another, but it's always awful when it's like, we had to change the story entirely because of gameplay decisions, because otherwise it wouldn't work with the gameplay. It's like, that's the worst. They need to work in tandem with one another.
Mm-hmm.
But, do you want to really quickly discuss some games you think did this well versus did this poorly? I think we have some time for that.
We already mentioned BioShock, The Last of Us Part 2. So those are really good examples of how to do lore. I think Breath of the Wild did a really great job of establishing the lore of the game behind the progress of the game. So as you're playing as Link and you're going through the 4 dungeons of the game that are linked to the 4 champions from 100 years ago, you get that backstory as you approach and go through each dungeon, and the character and
just the exploration of the world itself has so many nooks and crannies of things that it gives you just exploring the world itself gives you an idea as to how the events of the past have shaped the world that you're in now, which is a wonderful, when you can do it through visual cues and be like, oh, clearly there was a battle here, because you can see the broken corpses of the Guardians or whatever, and and you can see how the landscape is scarred. That gives you an indication that a battle happened here and it was probably crazy. And it tells you a bit of the history without any single words coming up on the screen. It's like, mwah, I love it.
Yep. And the desert town with the females only, and that's an active thing that's against Link. You can't go in this town because you're a male and you have to get your disguise. But the reasons why that was established is part of the lore of the game. So it's a perfect example of the lore of the game changing in the actual gameplay narrative experience. But I think Breath of the Wild is amazing. We always talk about it. It's not an 80-bit Pod Smash episode without talking about Breath of the Wild or World of Warcraft.
Yep.
Ghost of Tsushima, I think, also did a really good job. Oh, God of War. That's right. We haven't mentioned God of War yet, and that's
which
a
also
lore-ridden
has
game.
incredible lore in it. Yeah, and then the way they deliver it is fantastic. Yeah, no, you brought up Ghost of Tsushima, and Ghost of Tsushima is almost one of the best examples of what I was talking about earlier, where it's like the lore will influence things that happen in the game, and Ghost of Tsushima does it it does it well, primarily through side quests. You could play through the entire game and just power through the main narrative, and cool, awesome, you'll have a great experience. But like, if you take the time to do the side quests, there's almost always some kind of payoff that is rooted in the historicity of the island of Tsushima. But the best ones are the traveling bards or whatever. They're not bards, that's a very Western term, but like the storyteller guys, the monks, who like tell you about like these legendary heroes and either the like equipment they had, the legendary equipment, or the legendary moves they learned. And then you go and you find that artifact or you learn that move, and it's all rooted in story and all motivated by story and legend, like in-game legend and in-game lore. That's even further like an inspiration by, like, it's inspired by actual historical legends and tales. And it's so good. Like the way they put it together was fantastic. But yeah, I mean, and God of War does that. God of War also kind of does that too, where it like, especially the new one, where it's like you have Mimir telling all these stories to Kratos and Atreus.
I love Mimir.
And you get this idea, like, again, he talks about Ragnarok, which is this future event that involves time travel as well in the past. So it's all a big circle, like an Ouroboros. And like, we know, then those events, like, they keep talking about Ragnarok and Fimbulwinter and all that stuff. And then, like, at the end of the game, it's like, boom, Thor shows up, Ragnarok is coming. And then, like, we now know, of course, that that's that's going to be the main plot of the second entry. So, again, it's the lore that Mimir is telling you. Any of these stories that he tells you, you could either encounter the deity or the monster or whatever he's talking about. Like, those will likely be aspects of the future game. So that's what makes the lore really rich in that game. So I think, so I mean, we, like you said, we're contractually obligated to talk about God of War, so I figured I'd throw it in there as another one that does the lore well.
Yep.
So what are some that do lore poorly?
Well, I was thinking of The Witcher is a gray area, because we mentioned The Witcher earlier and how they do lore well with its fully fleshed out side quests that always have way more depth and meaning than you think at the surface. But there is also a couple of books and The Witcher 1 and Witcher 2 games, which the third game is what I'm referring to the most, because that's the one I've played. Like, there are events in the original Witchers that affect the relationship between Yennefer and Triss and Geralt. And I don't know any of that stuff, and they did not use that lore well to fill those gaps. And so, like, I just kind of had these, okay, they have a history, and that's kind of it. And to me, it left a little bit of a blank spot. So they could have used some smart ways of using lore to fill those gaps. Also, there's a lot of things to read that I don't feel like reading when it comes to, like, you walk into a random town and there might be a quick side quest in this town, but there's a million question marks on the map and you want to get through them as fast as you can. So, like, you've already feel overwhelmed as a player because there's so much to do. The last thing you want to do is, like, read a 5-page exhortation from some mage in a village somewhere that had an experience that really doesn't have any impact on the story. So it's kind of just that noise lore that I was talking about before. So The Witcher does both good things with lore and bad things. So I wanted to highlight that. Also, Destiny had this crazy depth grimoire, like, books that were available at some point, I think online, that you could read that fleshed out the Destiny story, but had zero relevancy to the game. And I thought that was really disjointed, and it was super heavy and a lot of extra work for the player with no reward. And then Skyrim, as I mentioned earlier, where it's just shoveling lore down your throat in droves with everything you interact with, every single character in the game, every NPC, every random kid, random person, peasant, knight, king has, like, this crazy backstory. Whether you want to pursue it or not, you can read all of the books on the shelf in a library, and they're all like 20 to 50 pages, and you can just sit for hours and pore over all of the extra lore. But I don't think it's relevant to the game or the plot, and so it kind of feels like that extra noise when you're already overwhelmed by a ton of side quests and a ton of things to do.
Yep, and I mean, I mentioned Final Fantasy earlier, and, the same reasons. It's just like, not all Final Fantasy games, obviously, and the ones that are nicely self-contained, like Final Fantasy 7, 8, a lot of the earlier franchises too. But like a lot of the ones later where they had the whole like crystal, like where they started trying to tie the worlds together and like this is the crystal triad or whatever, where it was like, I think it was like the 13 and then Type 0 and then some other ones where they were trying to like tie them together into like a single like multiverse or whatever. And it just got again proper noun syndrome, where it was just like, this is ridiculous. I don't understand any of these words, what they are, much less what's happening on the screen. So that can get a little overwhelming. I even felt a little bit that way about Final Fantasy 14, but I've been told Final Fantasy 14 story is really good, the MMO, when you really dig into it, and you know, kind of play through it. But I don't know if I have the patience for that. And when I tried to live stream it, it was not good. Not that it might have been the live stream was compounding the problems, but like maybe it was my computer. I don't know, but it got so laggy and awful that I'm turning it off. I'm done with it. I'm not doing this. So I have not touched it since. But yeah, so I'd be willing to give it a chance, but definitely. I have a little bit of apprehension for 16 because I'm like, is this going to be another story that's just too proper nouny? I don't know. I also don't know how 15's was, so maybe 15 was able to condense the story into a nice, appreciable narrative as well. But I find, and I feel like there's just a lot of games like that are just so glutted with their own in-game lore that like for newcomers, it's like tedious to try to even wrap your head around. So I can't think of any off the top of my head other than the Final Fantasy, but I feel like there's plenty that are out there.
Luckily, the Final Fantasy games aren't continuous, unless you're talking about Final Fantasy 13, which there's 3 entries in that. You know, like you had mentioned, the whole like Chrysalis world or whatever they called it. Outside of that, like every Final Fantasy game is its own entry, so you don't have to worry about franchise
coming back to that.
Like
I think they're coming back around to that. It seemed like though there was, and it must have been that like late 2000, early 2010s point for the franchise where I felt like they wanted to tie all their worlds together, and that's why they did the like Chrysalis blah 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 thing. And then they realized this isn't working and no one likes this, so let's just go back to self-contained stories for each franchise, for each entry. That's my take on it, at least. But it seemed like they really wanted to try to tie it all together. And if it had been successful, they might have even found a way to try to tie them all together. But I don't know. That would have been nuts. So anyway, so we want to hear from you guys. What do you think are games that have like awesome, rich in-game lore? And what are games that just had awful lore? Do you like good lore when you come across it? Or are you the kind of person that's just like, I just want to deal with what's in front of me, the story at hand? We want to hear those thoughts from you as well. So we mentioned earlier the places where you can have those conversations. There will be a Reddit post. And there, obviously you can always talk to us about your thoughts and your feedback on Discord. But Termite, where can the good pod smashers of the internet find us to communicate with us or just to enjoy the content that we create?
I will give you the cliff notes because I think I've already said it a couple of times. 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website with all of our platform links, both social media and podcasts. Check out our Discord server, interact with us there, and then twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash, where you can interact with us live. Once again, we have our Apple Podcasts review promise out there. We will promise to read any review you guys post for us at Apple Podcasts, so please go leave us a review. It helps us get bubbled up in the algorithms so we can have more discoverability and people can come hear our content. If you like us, go tell the world that you like us through Apple Podcasts so that other people can also experience this great content. We promise to read your review on the show. It doesn't matter what it says. It doesn't matter what the rating is. We will read it. The only stipulation is that it has to be family friendly, so we might have to censor it. But we haven't gotten a review since August, and we would love to have more on the show to read because they're fun. So please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts.
Huzzah! Well, next week we will do the one that was supposed to happen this week, which is game endings. We're going to talk about how games end, whether it's their final cinematic storytelling beat, or whether it's just maybe they don't end. Maybe they're endless EverQuests, so to speak. But we'll talk about the sort of narrative endings and final beats of gameplay in games, and talk about how all that's handled and how that can be good or bad or ugly or in between, everything in between. So that is next week's episode on October 19th, and we'll see you then.
See you next week.